We're still in the crisp edited book, Griffin on Human Rights, and we're now in Chapter 4, Alan Buchanan's article of the Egalitarianism of Human Rights. So this one is going to look at the nature of egalitarianism as a concept that has been historically, in terms of legal issues, in terms of, again, historically, in terms of legal issues and practices, has been part of the discourse of human rights, and that philosophers really haven't taken that into account. And it's important to. Okay, so where do you begin talking about human rights, right? You know, like how do we do this? Again, we've seen this over and over, like people, you know, criticizing Griffin for his starting point of normative agency. It's not clear, his presuppositions aren't clear, he doesn't theorize enough, doesn't relate it to moral rights and the deontic general realm as well. So this one here starts off with similar concerns. So where do you begin? Well, with Beitz and Nickel, two thinkers on human rights, you should start with legal doctrine, practices, and these are all embedded. This is a very concrete approach, and you do a critical reconstruction. You dive in, you look at that, and you do a critical reconstruction of that. In other words, it's kind of all sorts of ideas and all that, and you try to arrange it in a rational kind of form, a critical reconstruction of it. And what will that look like? Well, it depends on what you've got. You start with these documents and practices, and you try to pull out and analyze, break it all up, and then synthesize it in a form that looks more like, like a series of propositions or whatnot. It's sometimes called like a rational reconstruction. So something might be messy, and you're looking for the underlying principles. So it's like a direct one. You don't go through theory or whatever. And he calls this the international human rights kind of approach. It doesn't make any sense because outside of the system of states, because you're looking at, concrete interactions, concrete stuff, right? So that's why he says, it starts by the concrete. So it makes no sense outside a system of states because we're looking at human rights in sort of the broad context. The other approach, which despite, all his criticisms of Griffin, Buchanan sort of lumps John Tsoulas's approach in with Griffin, is you don't look at all the documents and stuff. You really are trying to go the substantive approach, right? We heard Griffin talk about that, and looking sort of like to moral issues directly, not going through the legal and all the practices. And then you come up with some ideas of what human rights are grounded on. People may differ on that, but the values, normative agency, all that kind of stuff. And then you use that sort of theorized conception of human rights to then critique this. So you don't go directly to this as Beitz and Nickel do. You go through this kind of straight to the human rights issue and then theorize about them. And then you move to critique of this. And so for Buchanan's approach, he's going to just call this the human rights thing. So the international human rights, this going straight to the embedded stuff, and then the human rights HR is going straight to the human rights and then going to the embedded stuff. This one, of course, is solitary, so it can make sense because you're theorizing independently of all this stuff, whereas this one is basically theorizing dependent on this, so it makes no sense on its own outside of states. This one does. So in other words, this is a more abstract philosophical approach, and this is a more of a sociological approach. You could think of it that way if that helps. And what Buchanan is seeing is that in in these documents and all the discourse, the ongoing discourse of human rights, if you look at it, not the philosophical stuff, but what people are actually saying and practicing, and lawyers and all that, it has a strong egalitarian bent to it, a strong egalitarian notion, which he'll call the grounded on the concept of equal status, and that will come up here, which I abbreviate as ES, equal status. That's extremely important, and it's largely been neglected by thinkers like Griffin and Tsoulas. Philosophers have been too abstract about this. They're not looking at it in a concrete way, and the concrete way is saying, look, it's all about equal status. And so in that sense, when Griffin and Tsoulas look at their rational reconstruction of this, that's gone through this critique, it's actually kind of revisionist. It changes things a lot because it's really ignoring a key component. So if you look at the historical stuff and you have your theory and you bring it to the situation, okay, so your theory could actually dominate and cause you to misread a tradition. In other words, there's a little bit of logic to get straight here. What Buchanan is saying is that when you look at it at the international human rights, sort of this approach, right, all the embedded stuff, both these two and these two would say, if there are problems here, then we may have to modify what the practices are. Everybody seems to agree with that. If something doesn't make sense or if it's problematic, we may have to modify it. But with this added step by Griffin and Tsoukalos, that they have this kind of theory and then they use the theory to critique that, if this practice runs into a conflict with your theory, then you would automatically say to modify this sort of discourse, this ongoing discourse. And if you do that, you're actually being revisionist in certain cases where something that might be very major, like the egalitarian strand in the actual practice and legal issues of human rights. If you say, well, my theory doesn't really recognize that, so I'm going to jettison that, you're actually doing a very revisionist view of history because you're neglecting something that was, on the one hand, important to history, but it conflicts with your theory, so the theory says throw it out. And that's what Buchanan is saying, is that these theorists in their abstract approach are actually more revisionist than they may think. Because some cases, right, if there's conflict here, you don't always just modify this. Maybe you need to modify this. That's Buchanan's main point. And so do you always do that? No, you don't just do this, if the conflict modify. No, some cases, and I put a little asterisk here, of HR would stay the same. Some instances that conflict with your theory, you modify your theory. That's his approach, is that you don't always lean on your human rights theory. Maybe in other words, if your theory conflicts with tradition, sometimes maybe the tradition's right. Sometimes you shouldn't throw out elements of the tradition. They might be right. Your theorizing is wrong, right? And we all know that there's lots of examples where people have theorized about ethics and values and morals and came up with some kind of theoretical framework and then said, hey, what are our actual practices of ethics and morals and things like that? Oh, well, our theory says don't do that. And you pitch something out that's been, used a lot. You might be throwing out something valuable, and it might be a mistake of your theory. And so Buchanan is saying egalitarianism is something that's not really fitting into what these guys are talking about, and they want to throw it out. No, we shouldn't do that. We should modify our theories and bring egalitarianism in, right? So in other words, traditional things sometimes should win. So don't be blinded by your theory, in other words. And so he wants to then turn, again, there's a lot going on in this article, but then Buchanan says, okay, I got to make this a bit more plausible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a number of ways, 7, I think it's 7, maybe there's more, but he looks at several ways, several respects in which this tradition of this discourse, this legal practices and all this stuff has egalitarianism built in. And the egalitarianism is grounded on this concept of equal status. And this is extremely important. And it's largely, again, been, as according to Buchanan, this notion of equal status as a concept playing a key role has been neglected. And so why has it been neglected? Well, sometimes people are blinded by their theories, that their theory doesn't really have it. And so they tend to eliminate it or reduce it or whatever. They don't take it as seriously as the tradition does. So this equal status is an important one, and it's part of it, and we should keep it in. And this is where, in order to sort of buttress this idea of keeping it in, Buchanan says, look, other things like dignity can be helped out by equal status, right? Because he says, there's lots of things that that equal status can help us out with. For instance, he looks at two examples that would be helped out. For instance, two examples of historical denials that we now look at as intrinsically wrong, like colonialism and fascism. What did they both do? What did they have in common? Well, you can point out a lot of historical things, but the essence is that both of those frameworks, right, denied equal status, right? They said, look, in the end, some people are superior to others. They denied the very fundamental of equal status, and that is an inherently moral flaw of one of them, right? There's a lot more, but that's his point here. Both rejected the notion of equal status for all persons. Now, other concepts that feed into the development of human rights, like dignity, he uses lots of examples. I'll just look at dignity, can be helped out by this concept of equal status. For instance, and he gives this kind of example. It's something to think about. Right? You might think that person X has dignity, and that would mean, oh yeah, they have like a right to food or something like, or shelter. But this, you can find things in the history that did this, right? Separate but equal, right? Segregation, in the United States years back. That, oh, well, yeah, everyone has a right to, they have dignity, or they have a right to food or water or whatever, but not everybody can have their food at the same place or their water at the same place. In other words, you might say, oh yeah, someone is eligible to get food, but they're not eligible to eat at my table or something like that, right? So the dignity element is helped out by bringing in equal status. No, in the sense that you can't. You might want to be able to argue that you in some way can uphold dignity, but not and violate equal status. But if you say no, equal status has to be built in, then you would say, well, not only does that person have their dignity to give them the right to the food, they can eat at my table. Everybody can eat at the same table. So bringing in this notion of equal status helps flesh out the concept of dignity, because again, we would look very suspiciously at someone who says, my concept of dignity says, yeah, you can have food, but you can't eat at my table or something like that. Again, this sort of notion of segregation would clearly, violate this notion of equal status. So he says, some of these other concepts which, had played a role and were used, when you bring in the concept of equal status, they get fleshed out, and a more morally appropriate system evolves from that. Okay, so again, that's why by ignoring this, he thinks that these guys have more revisionist notions of history than they're willing to admit. So even though they might claim they're doing a bottom-up thing or whatever, and looking at actual history, they're really not. They're being too top-driven by their theoretical approaches. And so for the rest of the article, Buchanan goes on, examines various theories and their justifications for claims, and his goal is to determine, can they really handle the importance of equal status that he says is in the history of international human rights. And he says that it really, they can't do it all that well. And although he seems to, as I read him, he seems to lean more that Nicol has a bit better of an approach overall than Griffin. But he says, anyway, so you can have a look at his discussion of these other concepts. But I'm just going to move to the end of the article. He says that there's a couple ideas that we should think about to help us think more deeply about human rights. That, first off, they're deeply connected. They're deeply connected. The tradition shows us they're deeply connected to the concept of equal status. And we shouldn't always look at judgments of inferiority or whatever in other terms, like less capacity for autonomy or whatnot. No, because that's how sometimes it was done. But we should always tie notions of judgments like inferiority or whatever to violations of equal status. And in that sense, if we do that, keeping this in mind, this egalitarianism that's at the heart of the tradition, keep that in our mind, keep that front and center in our minds when in our theorizing, and we'll get better theories and more universal theories and better, more adequate and more useful theories when it comes to resolving conflicts in issues of human rights. See you next video.